Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all our attendees joining us today for this latest Data Science Central webinar. This is Bill Vorhies, your host. I'm the Editorial Director with Data Science Central and also Chief Data Scientist for Data Magnum. Now, I'd like to start off our event today by thanking Tableau for sponsoring today's event. Tableau is a longtime supporter of the Data Science Central community, and we're honored to have them sponsoring our event today. I'd also like to take this opportunity to mention and show our appreciation for some of our other recent sponsors, including SAP, Crowdflower, Databricks, IBM, and Alteryx, to name just a few. Now, past webinars are available on demand at datasciencecentral.com. And if you haven't had the opportunity to view them, I encourage you to take a look. They provide some very useful insight into a wide variety of topics of interest to our data science community. Today's webinar is entitled Building Better Maps with Tableau, and to be presented by Tableau. So before we begin, I'd like to briefly review the format of today's webinar. Today's event will be an hour long. We have one presenter who I'll introduce in just a minute. There'll be 10 or 15 minutes of Q&A following the presentation, and this event is being recorded and will be available on datasciencecentral.com later this afternoon following today's live event. Now, I'd also like to encourage our attendees to provide questions throughout the presentation. We'll be reviewing and presenting them on your behalf during the Q&A portion of today's event. Well, I'm very pleased to introduce today's speaker, Sarah Battersby with Tableau. Sarah's primary area of focus is cartography, with an emphasis on cognition. Her work emphasizes how to help people visualize and use spatial information more effectively. Her research has covered a variety of areas, including perception in dynamic map displays, geospatial technologies, and spatial thinking abilities, and the impact of map projections on spatial cognition. Sarah earned her PhD in geography in 2006 from the University of California at Santa Barbara. She's a member of the International Cartographic Association Commission on Map Projections and is a past president of the Cartography and Geographic Information Society and the National Geospatial Advisory Committee. So Sarah, thanks for being with us. We're looking forward to your presentation today. Now, our world is rich with geographic data. From point coordinates to country names, maps are key to understanding and utilizing that information. These days, with just a computer and an internet connection, anyone can be empowered to explore and present their geographic data. Unfortunately, there's no guarantee that anyone understands the principles of spatial data or visual and cartographic best practices. While many map authoring tools do provide design guidance, it's still easy to mislead readers. So based on choices a cartographer makes in data collection, cleaning, analysis, and visualization, their cartographic license, a map's unique capacity for geographic data insights, can be severely compromised, intentionally or otherwise. So in today's Data Science Central webinar, Sarah will discuss how cartographic license can be used and abused by the map designer, and how this ultimately impacts a map reader's ability to see and understand geographic data. So Sarah, with that, I'm going to turn it over to you. You can begin as soon as you are ready to go.
Thank you, Bill. So as Bill said, my name is Sarah Battersby, and I'm a member of Tableau Research. I've been at Tableau for about 3 years, and prior to coming here, I was a professor of geographic information science. So I do like to spend my time thinking about maps. And today I'm going to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is building better maps and thinking about how we can minimize inadvertent misinterpretation of maps that we create. So for this presentation, I have a few simple goals. The first is to explain a bit about some of the ways that people intuitively make sense of patterns on maps. The second is to talk about what you can and should be thinking about as you design a map so that you can more effectively guide people to interesting spatial patterns. But as is the case with many things in life, there'll be dragons along the way. So I'm going to talk about a few of the big quote-unquote dragons that come up in map design. But know that this talk is going to be far from comprehensive. So after the talk, feel free to be in touch if you want to talk more about resources for cartographic design or general spatial visualization challenges in Tableau or outside of Tableau. And it looks like the view that I'm seeing is a few slides behind where I am, so I'm going to hopefully let that catch up. So a bit of background on how I approach the topic of thinking about cartographic visualization. When we are making or reading a map, we can look at a map in two different ways. The first is what I have showing us the vertical axis here, which is the question of, is the data appropriately represented? This is really a question of whether the data is appropriate for the map and is following basic symbolization principles that would support an easy-to-interpret map. The second is thinking about how nice the map looks. So let's just say that this is on a scale of, would your mom or spouse or roommate say, thanks, but I'm not going to hang this piece of cartographic art on the fridge, all the way up to, National Geographic scale on the other end, a really well-designed map. When we put those two axes together, if we have high quality and completely appropriate data representation, but the design is amateurish or unattractive, we end up with a map with great data, but it really isn't seen as being a credible source of information. Now, on the other hand, if we have a high quality National Geographic level design, but the data is bad, we end up in an even worse misleading but believable category. My goal with most of my work is to help people target the sweet spot of good design and good data representation, where we can go straight to the process of seeing and understanding spatial data and not be distracted by poor design or poor data choices. So I think these questions of how you design a good map are particularly interesting when we consider the state of the current landscape. I think we're at an interesting point where mapping is really an expected function in most visualization products. For instance, I have 3 different mapping products shown here. You can think about the automated design and analyses functions built into products such as Tableau or Carto or Esri's ArcGIS Online product, just to name a few. I think there's been broad acceptance of the importance of spatial data and huge interest in taking advantage of the bountiful harvest of available data sets. Also, great advances in the software that have made it drag and drop easy to start visualizing data, performing analyses, and communicating the results to the audience. Essentially, anybody who wants to make a map can. So in theory, if you have spatial data, you have this full cartographic license to go forth and do some spatial magic. But my experience is that no matter how carefully we design mapping software, how clever we get with trying to help users do the right thing, there are still some significant hurdles to feeling confident that you've done the right things with your data and that your map design is really going to be effective. Personally, I think that good software will really never eliminate the need to think critically about your map data and design. While good software can help, and it can make the process easier and more pleasant, ultimately, the person making the map needs to be able to intervene with their knowledge of how people intuitively understand and misunderstand spatial data. So just in case you were afraid there wouldn't be an official cartographic license based on the abstract, here is the official cartographic license. And this is one of the more lighthearted ways that I like to think of our role as map makers, is that we have this cartographic license. And similar to a driver's license, this license allows us certain rights and responsibilities. So we have the right to practice the art and the science of cartography. So thinking about both the design and the data behind our maps. But there's a significant caveat here. Just having this license isn't going to protect you from distortion or misuse of the maps that you make. As a cartographer or someone with cartographic license, you're really charged with trying to do good. And if you violate the basic rules of good cartography, just like driving, you're going to earn points against your license. And I know that I'm remote from you, but if you get enough, I may come haunt you and take your license away. And in case you're curious, I did actually make these cartographic licenses, and I give them out to people occasionally. So what this cartographic license gets you is things like the freedom to adjust map content, layout, appearance, and more importantly, level of distortion due to map projection. It gives you the responsibility to choose between bad data and no data, because spatial data can be quite weird, and the data that you find may not be exactly right for your specific task, but it may be all that you can get, so you have to just deal with what those consequences will be. And of course, you get the opportunity to create new cartographic truths as needed. So we'll talk about some of these issues and some of the decisions that you can make to use your cartographic license more wisely. So I'll start out with just a few fun examples as a bit of context for when things go epically wrong. And then we'll move into some of the more subtle challenges of making a map that helps you really understand spatial patterns. So hopefully you've had a few seconds to take a look at this particular map and try and figure out the problem that is presented. And feel free to just yell the answer out at your computer. I'm sure everyone in the office will enjoy hearing what you have to say. So the big problem here is that it turns out that the country that they have labeled as Switzerland really isn't Switzerland. And that's a pretty significant problem when you're trying to understand spatial relationships. Or one of my personal favorites. So this is a map that was custom made for me by a former student, and she was actually trying to find as many horrible things that she could do in one map. I think she did a very nice job at that. I think in terms of the design side of things, this is one of the worst that I've seen. So this would definitely be a license taking away map. But I think the best part of this map to me is that when I asked her what happened to Idaho, she laughed and told me that she didn't realize that she had accidentally deleted it. Or this one that is probably a little easier to guess than the mislabeling of Switzerland example. And I did spend a little bit of time trying to come up with a good justification for this. And thanks to Google Maps, this is the best that I could do. I'm still not quite sure what the challenge was with this labeling. So now let's move into some of the deeper content and talk about right things to do when making a map and how you can make better decisions in designing effective maps. The first question you should always think about is why you need a map. When I was teaching university classes, I'd often ask the students a question like this at the start of class, and the initial answer was normally something along the lines of, maps are really cool and pretty and I like them. Or because I have spatial data, I have data attached to counties or countries or latitude and longitude. Or because I'm enrolled in a cartography class and I can make maps because the software makes it easy. Those are all some of the sorts of questions or the answers that I would get to that question from my students. And in general, I would say these are all really bad reasons to make a map. The reason that you make a map is because it helps answer a spatial question. Before you start any mapping project, figure out what that question is and how a map is going to help you answer the question. And then make it look awesome and informative, just like the set of maps that I'm showing from a cartographer by the name of John Nelson. John's one of my favorite cartographers, and I think he designs really creative, amazing, informative, engaging maps. And I think that you could say that these are all good maps because they're pretty and they have spatial data, but they're better maps because they really have spatial questions, and there was a good purpose behind each one of them. So let's start out looking at this asking good spatial questions with a bad spatial question. Even though it sounds sort of spatial, what county has the highest adult obesity rate? So this map is just showing all of the counties in the lower 48 states with the percent obesity in each state, in each county. I can see some general patterns on the map, and I could probably pull out some of the higher value counties, but can I really answer the question of interest? Well, if I'm trying to figure out the county with the highest obesity rate, really the only way that I could do that would be by trying to find the darkest counties and then putting my mouse over each one of them and trying to figure out which one is the highest. And, there are only a few thousand counties, so it's totally a doable problem. Okay, it probably really isn't. So this isn't a great way of answering our question. But if you use a different visualization, you can answer the question really quickly. With a bar chart, for instance, I can quickly sort, get the answer, and if I need the location, I could link it back to the map to highlight the location of interest. So to start with, we really picked a bad map question, but a good question for other visualizations. The point here is, don't always just jump to the map because you have location in the question. Ask what you need to know about the location. Is it related to value or to spatial context? And you can always link your visualizations up to a map if you need the location reference. Now, if we wanted to know something about regional clustering, this is a great map to use. Granted, if you can mentally picture the previous map, you might notice that I've made a few changes to the design to more clearly emphasize the regions with higher values. In this case, a small design decision and a change in the question that we were trying to answer really helped improve the effectiveness of the map. The main change that I made here is really simple. It's just that the map uses only 4 shades now instead of this infinite color ramp of shades, and each shade represents 25% of the counties. What this does is it makes it much easier to quickly pull out the high and low value counties and to see the variation across the United States, which allows us to see these clusters of values a lot more easily. Another quick example is this map of the GDP of Axis and allied powers. So this is the type of map that I see tweeted and sent out on social media fairly regularly. What spatial question does this answer? So I can see an approximate location for the different countries, but no exact location. I don't get a sense of what countries share borders if I want to think about alliances. I can see an approximate total for GDP for each country using the size of the circles on the map, but it's hard to put these together into a big picture for comparison. While the map might be big on social media, it really doesn't answer a clear question. So on the other hand, just like in the previous example, we can pull out the patterns in GDP really quickly with any number of other visualizations. And then if we want, we could pair it with a map for location information. Though preferably we would probably use polygons to represent the countries instead of point symbols, so we could really understand what the geographic relationship is between these regions. So let's assume that we're using a map for answering good spatial questions. We've already got our good question in mind. The next important step in design is picking symbols that are intuitive and play into how people naturally make sense of data patterns. While many software packages make good suggestions about what will work for your data based on whether it's numeric or text data, the systems aren't going to be perfect. So it's really worth spending a few minutes thinking about whether the defaults help or hinder interpretation. And spending a little time asking how close you've gotten to the data. Most of the time when you're making a map, you know your data very well. And that makes it so that you can deal with some bad symbolization more easily than somebody that doesn't really understand the data, because you already know the patterns that you're looking for. So to emphasize why you really should be thinking about the intuitive nature of symbols, we'll use this really beautiful specimen of a map. So this is from the USGS. It is a map of water use. So it's domestic freshwater use, withdrawals, and deliveries. And think about this for a few seconds to try and logic out which states are the highest water users and which are the lowest. Now, when I use this example with an in-person audience, I pretty quickly get a lot of different colors being yelled out. I have never had a room full of people agree on how the colors are ordered from least to greatest water usage. Is yellow greater than light blue? Is it less than green? It's really difficult to know. So I've just uncovered the legend so you can take a look at the answer. And you think about whether it matched up with what you expected. Was it easy to figure out what the colors meant? For the person making the map, it may have been completely intuitive, but I really had a difficult time understanding the pattern in this. It's really not a quick map to interpret. And the more time you spend reading the legend, the less time you're spending figuring out the patterns in the data, which doesn't make for a very good, effective map. As a rule of thumb, I wanted to give you some basic guidelines that will carry you through in most decisions with making maps and picking intuitive symbolization. If you're working with numeric data and you want to show relationships from more to less, you'll typically use a color scheme with a strong light to dark continuum. For point locations, you can use sized proportional symbols. So use that size to show relative value. Small is less, larger is more. Or if you have numeric data with an inflection point of interest, for instance, positive and negative growth rates where there's an inflection point at 0, or you want to emphasize values above and below the national average, you can pick one of these diverging, not just more or less, which side of the inflection point each value falls on. And just for reference, all of the color examples here are from a great tool called Color Brewer, which is colorbrewer.org. It's an online tool for helping with cartographic color choices. I think it's really a great go-to that I can recommend, especially if you're anything like me and feel a little bit of terror when people ask you to pick pretty colors for things. It has great color choices, and it's really helpful, particularly if you're designing maps for audiences with color vision impairments, or you need to know something that will look really good in print, and so forth. On the other hand, with categorical data, we want to be careful to not imply any numerical relationships, so no more or less that we see with light and dark values. The main thing is just to imply different. Typically, we do this with distinct color or hue and shapes. Occasionally, there will be examples where you do want light and dark versions of the same color, such as if you have several categories of forest. So I have sparse forest and dense forest shown under subcategories. It makes more sense to use different shades of green instead of, say, yellow, red, and purple for different types of forest. Just try to match the shades with some relevant attribute of the category. For instance, I thought that sparse forest might be better as a lighter green and dense forest as a darker green. Or for point locations, there are a lot of standardized symbol sets that you can look for, like the one from the National Park Service that I've added in the lower right corner of the slide. You really get a lot of benefit from picking symbols that don't require careful study of the legend, and they're often really good open source, free license symbol sets that you can use so that you don't have to design your own. Now, when you're working with ordered categories and you want to imply these are categorically different, but there isn't a numerical relationship between them, for instance, high, medium, and low, you often go with these color sets that have particular metaphorical relationships, like red, yellow, and green for good, okay, and bad, or fast, medium, and slow on a traffic map. So let's go back to our original water map and apply some basic intuitive symbolization. I think it's a lot more informative to just make a map that looks like this one, where we have intuitive symbolization with light blue for our low water usage and dark blue for our high water usage. And we're using blue as the color choice because semantically it makes sense with our topic of water. So I'll just point out this is often a good call if you use colors that align with the topic, but be careful. One of the things that I encountered pretty much every semester when I was teaching cartography classes, we'd have to have the class talk about why it was inappropriate to use quote unquote flesh tone color schemes to make a map of racial distributions. I'll just say you're never going to get that one right, so I suggest that you don't go there. So moving on, let's take a step back to consider problems with the underlying data, because remember, we want both good data representation and a nice looking map. So we're going to go back to the water usage map that I cleaned up and think about the fact that this is really a pretty bad map. So what does it tell me? Well, what it's telling me is that the states that have the highest water usage are California, Texas, Florida, New York. And if I think about all of those states, they have something really interesting in common. So keep that what they have in common in the back of your mind as we look at the next few examples. And then we're going to come back to this map and fix it up a little bit. So a little diversion while you think about the water map. This is one of my favorite XKCD comics. Now, I feel pretty confident that you've all seen maps that are about as informative as any of the three maps in this comic. You may have even made them. I know that I definitely have. And it often takes a minute to think, step back, and realize that we're not really showing an informative pattern, and the relationships that we're finding really may just be that we're looking at all of the places where there are a lot of people. This happens pretty often. I think this is a really beautiful map. This was a National Park Service project to look at loudness of a typical summer day from coast to coast, where we've got louder areas in the lighter yellows and quieter areas in the blue colors. The Park Service used some computer algorithms to make this soundscape. And I think it's a really cool project, but mostly what it's telling me is where the people are. It turns out that, oddly enough, it tends to be louder where there are more people and quieter where there are fewer people. So while the map's really beautiful, it isn't really telling me a whole lot that's super interesting. Or I see this in Tableau all the time. One of the recent Tableau visualizations of the day was bike thefts in the United Kingdom. And I looked at this and I thought, oh, that's really interesting, where all the bikes were stolen. And then I paired it up with the population density map, and I realized that, well, it turns out that where there are more people, there are probably more bikes. And where there are more bikes, there are probably more bikes to steal. And so what the bike theft map is showing me is, where do people with bikes live in the UK? So if we go back to our water map, what we're seeing is that the first map was really just a map showing us where do all the people live. Where there are more people, there's more water usage. So how can we use that knowledge to improve the map? What we want to do is we want to normalize our data, or take the influence of state population out of the picture. This is often true of any kind of count data. We want to make sure that the geographic regions we're comparing are on equal footing and that we can make direct comparisons between them. In the original map on top, we really can't make direct comparisons because more people equals more water use, and since we don't know how many people are in each state, we can't make any real comparisons between the states. But if we were to normalize or standardize our data and convert it to a relevant ratio, for instance, dividing by population in the map, we can come up with a more interesting measure, such as water withdrawals per capita, which allows us to make comparisons directly across states because we no longer have the influence of more people using more water. So there are a lot of different ways to normalize or standardize data. Most often, I find that it's to divide by population, so you have a per capita measure, or by area, so you have something like a per square mile or a density measure. But you might also look at dividing by the total, so we have a part versus whole, calculating a percent or some kind of measure such as the number per 10,000 people, or coming up with an arbitrary measure that you can take that can take you from a raw count attribute to a ratio. So for instance, let's say I wanted to look at some kind of crop yields. I know how many tons of peaches were produced in every state, and I know how many acres were planted. And so I can get this relative effectiveness of the peach crop. I know what was the yield per acre. Another example of the some other measure for division. This is one of my favorite examples that I used to refer to my students and tell them it was the official census dating map, the ratio of unmarried men to unmarried women. It isn't informative to just map the total number of men or the total number of women. That just tells us roughly where the population is larger. But for this case, we wanted to know the ratio for these two specific populations, so we might know where to target our new dating app. Next up is thinking about another problem that comes up with interpreting symbols on our map. It isn't just about picking the right color or making sure we have the right symbol type. It's important to consider how a map reader might interpret the symbols and how we might unintentionally mislead. So a not so big mapping secret is that most of your map readers aren't going to spend much time looking at your beautiful, carefully crafted map legend. They're going to look at the map, use some intuition and say, ooh, more stuff over here because the colors are darker, less stuff over there because the colors are lighter. So the choices you make with how to assign colors to values makes a significant difference in the observed pattern. So take, for instance, these three maps showing the percent population in poverty. They're just drawing class breaks between the values in three different places. We have a continuous color ramp on the left, an equal interval color ramp in the middle, and a quantile color ramp on the right. If I were going to use one of these maps to argue for, say, more services for people below the poverty line, I would probably use the map on the right, because more darker colors on the map imply that there are more areas that have people living below the poverty line. If I wanted to argue that no services were needed, I'd probably use one of the two maps on the left, where we see a lot more lighter colors on the map. And if you're not looking at how the values are assigned to different colors, all you really see is more stuff and less stuff. So on the left two maps, we see more of less stuff, and on the right map, we see more that there is more stuff. So this is a big cartographic license issue. There's nothing that says that you can't put the class breaks anywhere you want, so you could just adjust until you see the pattern that you want. Well, I think it's totally slimy to just adjust until the visual is most convincing. It really isn't unheard of. And so this is somewhere where cartographic license is a really big issue because you are making the decision of what the ultimate pattern is that a map reader is going to see. And if people don't spend a lot of time looking at the legend, then they're going to see the pattern that you tell them. My suggestion is that if you know your data really well, you want to think about what kind of interesting handholds you might be able to give the map readers to help them see patterns. So in the 2 seconds that they spend looking at the legend, they have something that they can use to help them make sense of the patterns. So in this example, I used a custom set of class breaks based around the national average. And it's a diverging color scheme so that values that are below the national average are gray and blue, and above the national average are different shades of orange. So you can really quickly pull out above, below, and how far above or below. There are really infinite ways that you can break up your data, and any choice will likely give you a different visual pattern. I'm often asked what the best option is, and this is really where your cartographic license comes into play. The best one is going to be the one that works for the story that you're trying to tell or explore with your data. And then you'll get creative with the symbolization to emphasize that story. Just for reference, in most mapping software, you're going to have a lot of out-of-the-box options that you could use. And I'd advise you to spend a couple minutes pondering the relevance of each when you're making a map. One of them might be just right for you, or none of them, and you want to make your own custom class breaks. But always come back to asking the question of, which set of class breaks is going to help you explain the pattern that's really important with your data? So the last rule I wanted to talk about, and remember, these aren't meant to be comprehensive, just a sampling of topics that I think are particularly important to consider. That no matter what you do, the map will always have a significant limitation that cannot be removed. We're trying to simplify an infinitely complex world into a single, simple, flat map. That means we're making a lot of compromises, and one of the biggest is with map projections. So map projections are one of my pet topics that I particularly like. Just a quick, what do I mean when I'm talking about map projections and the challenges of map projections? So think about the Earth being an orange or a baseball, and I had to put the baseballs in since it is postseason play right now, and I'm actively watching the Dodgers storm their way to the World Series. So think about the skin on the orange or the skin on a baseball and tearing it off. So you're going from the spherical surface, and you're trying to get that skin that you've just peeled off and press it down into a flat shape that you could use like a map. In order to make it look reasonable, you're going to start tearing it and stretching it and warping it and really mangling it. You're not going to be able to preserve all of the relationships that you have on the sphere on the flat plane. So when we do that, we typically end up with one of 4 different types of map projection. And these 4 types of map projection are going to preserve different properties. So properties that we would be able to measure accurately on the globe, some of them are going to be distorted when we try and measure them on the map. So the 4 general categories, we've got conformal projections. And I've highlighted that in red because the map that I'm showing right above the list is a conformal map projection. That's a Mercator map projection. And the blue circles that are drawn on top of it show you something about the distortion in that map projection. On the Earth, like on the sphere, those circles would all be the same size. But on the map projection, notice that they get larger and larger as you move towards the poles. That's a property of the conformal projection. The local angles are preserved, but the areas are not. So as we go towards the high latitudes, we get massive distortion of area. On the other hand, we have equal area projections. Equal area projections are going to preserve angle, but they're going to distort angular measurements. Equidistant projections are going to preserve distance, but really only from 1 or 2 points on the map, not between any combination of points on the map. And then we have compromise projections, which I would describe as preserving no property specifically, but generally looking nice. No matter what we do, we're going from spherical real world into planar map. And the map will look very different when we do that. These are three of my favorites, just to show you some of the range of different shapes that we can end up with map projections. We have the Mercator projection on top, which is conformal, so it's preserving angles but distorting areas. The Bond projection, which is equal area, so it's preserving areas but distorting angles. And it's probably the favorite of geography departments for making their t-shirts because it's a nice heart shape. And then the Armadillo, which is neither conformal nor equal area. For a bit of comparison for how different these map projections can be, I just took three common map projections: Mercator, conformal projection; Robinson, which is a compromise projection, and that's shown in green; and the sinusoidal projection, which is equal area projection, and I overlaid them on top of one another. So they're all centered right around 0 degrees of latitude and longitude, so right off of the Africa coast, and they are all at the same scale. Hopefully, this image makes it clear that all of these map projections are going to present a very different set of spatial relationships. Locations are in different places, countries are different sizes, distances are larger or smaller, depending on what property the map projection preserves. So why should you care about this for the maps that you might make? Well, think about the original problem of good data representation and good design. The projection can really come back and bite you. So here's what I think is a very nicely designed map with an interesting topic. But the topic is area-based. So we're looking at the surface area required to power the world. But the map projection that's being used to show the data is not equal area. And that makes me question whether or not the relative areas that are being shown with the boxes that indicate the surface area required for solar panels, it makes me wonder if that's actually correct. So all of a sudden, I'm very skeptical of this map because I know that it's not an equal area map projection. Or if you're working in an online mapping world, so Google and most other online maps will present you with a nice scale bar for calculating distances. But where is that scale bar right? So here's an example, and I've enlarged this so that is not really 1,000 miles on this map. It's just a reference to show you the scale bar. We can measure 1,000 miles using the scale bar that shows up in the corner of the map, but what can we measure with it? So I don't have complete confirmation on this, but I would guess that the point at which the scale bar is actually correct is around the middle of the viewing window. Now, if you want a really fun experiment with Google Maps, take a look at the scale bar as you pan north and south without changing the zoom level. The scale bar will adjust, even though you haven't changed the zoom level on the map. The reason for that is that the scale is not constant as you change latitude on the map. Remember with the examples of the Mercator projection that I showed you how those circles that I had drawn on the map were getting larger and larger away from the equator. That is the scale increasing. So this scale bar is really only going to be valid for measurements along a single line of latitude because the scale in Web Mercator is going to vary by latitude. So even though we're providing you this interesting information that you can use for distances, you can't really use it as a visual cue. I like the fact that in Tableau, while we provide a scale bar, we're, I would say, a little bit more open about the scale issues. And this makes me laugh every time I see it. Here is what we would show for a map of about the same scale as the Google map. That's right. So the map scale accuracy, accidentally jumped to the next slide. The map scale accuracy is plus or minus 4,000 miles at this particular location. And that's because if you were to take the scale at the far north end of the map and the far south end of the map, you would have very different measurements. And that scale bar is not, that distance is not equal to 1,500 miles everywhere across the map. Let's just say when you're working in an online mapping world, your mileage may vary. Another reason this matters is because people see a map and they generally believe that it's right. They also make some assumptions about the map. Like, for instance, those rules we learned in elementary school about the shortest distance between 2 points being a straight line. In this case, it leads to some funny results. So this is an example from The Economist a number of years ago. I think the cartography is very nice, but it turns out that the data is fairly bad. So this is showing distances that missiles can travel from North Korea. And since the shortest distance is a straight line, all we have to do is measure from the center, draw some circular buffers with that particular radius, and magic. We have a map that tells us how far the missiles can fly. But again, the problem is that your mileage will vary. And literally, because this is a map that doesn't preserve distances. So those circular flight regions are not the actual distance that the missiles can travel. They ended up printing a really nice correction using the same base map, but adjusting what the actual travel distances would be, because it turns out that the distances are not perfect circles when you're using a non-equidistant map projection. Now, it turns out this problem still happens quite a bit. And this is an example from earlier this year, so just a handful of months ago from a Zurich newspaper. And it was sent to me by a good cartographer friend who saw it, and we've talked about the missile example quite a bit. And she saw this in the paper and thought, oh my gosh, they're doing exactly the same thing. This is a Mercator projection with these circular buffers drawn on it that really don't show actual travel distance. So after several go-rounds, and I think she said it took 3 rounds with the editors in the newspaper to get them to finally fix the map and end up with a version that was correct, which is the version on the right for these 3 particular missiles. Or just a few days ago, I saw this example from Bloomberg, which I thought was really, really a wonderful example. It's a map drawn with an azimuthal equidistant projection. So note that is an equidistant projection. So when I draw circular buffers, the distances are correct. And that even includes a note that tells readers what the map projection is, which adds some really nice trust to the graphic. So I put that note in there, just saying that this uses an azimuthal equidistant projection, which preserves distances from the center and is not restricted to a hemisphere. I think that it would still be nice to place this next to a more traditional or familiar map projection so that it was easier for people to find locations of interest to them. But I think that this is just a fabulous example of dealing with the challenges of map projections and communicating to people about what's been done. Or an interesting and sneakier map projection issue to think about. I think of this as the houseboat real estate data. Or houseboat real estate sales in Seattle. So this is from a Redfin data set of house sales. And I have 2 different versions of the same data. One, both of these are latitude and longitude. One is if I plot the original data, and it turns out the original data was actually quite good. But I made some adjustments to the data to show a sneaky problem that happens with a lot of mapping software. There are a lot of different ways that you can measure the shape of the Earth. And when we talk about the shape of the Earth, we're talking about the datum that's being used. Now, most mapping software, at least online mapping software, is going to assume that you're using a particular datum, so a particular way of defining latitude and longitude. And that's the World Geodetic Survey of 1984. Now, if it turns out that you're using a different datum, and the map on the right is using the North American datum of 1927, you end up with these shifts. So even though your data looks like it's just pure latitude and longitude, your points may not end up in the right location, which is really an interesting, sneaky problem. Or another fun map projection problem. I ended up sitting next to some gentlemen on a flight back from Australia one time, and probably about 7,000 hours into the flight, one of them turns to the guy next to him and says, we would have been there so much sooner if the pilot had just flown straight. He was watching the plane creep along on the map on the screen in front of him. And unfortunately, he ended up sitting next to a cartography professor that was fully loaded with a lot of slides related to map projection issues. And we had a very nice conversation about how that was actually the shortest path, because what you're seeing on the map may not match up with your intuitive understanding of properties of the Earth. You also have interesting problems with analytic results. So this is using the Google Heat Map API. And what I did here is I created a little cluster of points, and I used the Heat Map API to look at where the hotspots were. And so I end up with what I had expected based on the data set that I had generated, a nice bright hotspot. And then I took that same data set, exactly the same spacing between the points, and I rotated it up to a fairly high latitude up in the northern hemisphere. And I created the heat map again. And this is the result that I get. These are exactly the same distribution of points on the Earth's surface, just in different locations. But the hotspots are very different. I can't actually make any valid comparisons between these because the way the heat map is created is based on pixel distance. So with a Web Mercator base map, the pixel distance represents a much larger ground distance in the higher latitudes. So you can't make comparisons between these two different locations. And just to give you some proof that they really are the same data set and they really are on the same map, you could see that if you were trying to make any interpretation between these two data sets, or these two sets of points, you really wouldn't be able to come up with any valid analytical comparison because they look very different and it's hard to understand that they're actually the same data set. Now, on the other hand, if we were using ground distance to create the heat map, we would have a nice small cluster down at the equator, and then we would have this giant cloud of doom up in the far northern hemisphere. So what does that mean for you and making maps? The big takeaway is that whenever you're working with maps in Tableau or other web maps in general, the distances and areas are going to be distorted because we use this map projection called Web Mercator. And this is something that you really don't have much of a choice about. For local scale mapping, it's really not much of an issue. But for large areas, it means that we get this visual overemphasis of high latitude regions. The Greenland is gigantic problem. And any visual and spatial analysis for large areas ends up being a little bit suspect. So, consider drawing a flight path for a plane. It's not really a straight line on that map. Radial selections or, any types of analytics that you do. Spatial binning, measuring distances, measuring directions. They really become sort of questionable across large areas. But that really isn't a battle that's easily fixed, and we could talk about that at another time if you're interested, but it is one that you really do need to think about because it's a significant limitation when you're making online maps. And so with that, I'm gonna go ahead and stop you with that warning that Web Mercator is scary. And I think I've given you probably enough to be dangerous with making some good and bad maps. And if you have any pressing map questions, I am open to answering them. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Bill to moderate some questions and answers.
Well, Sarah, thank you for that excellent presentation. So we'll get started with today's Q&A. And I want to thank the audience for their participation. We've had a lot of questions that have come in, and we'll do our best to get through them all in the time remaining. So during this Q&A session, I'll leave up this screen with contact information for Sarah if you'd like to contact her following today's webinar. So let's get started. Sarah, Web Mercator bad, other things good. If Web Mercator shows such distortion, why does it seem to be the most commonly used format for online maps?
Yeah, I mean that's a really good question of why it's so popular. I mean, it really took off in the mid-2000s because it was the map projection that was the base for Google Maps. Prior to that, there were some other map projections that were being used, but they were often not at the global scale. So the benefit that Web Mercator gives you is it's really a big square. And when you think about it mathematically and how much computation has to be done to serve and deliver map tiles, because it's a big square, it's really easy to chop into much smaller squares. So they're easy to index, they're easy to deliver, and the equations are really, really simple. So because of those factors, it's really become a standard because there aren't a whole lot of other really good square map projections that you can choose from. But I've seen some really neat research in the last handful of years, especially as we move away from having raster tiles for web-based maps where we can do more vector data, so points, lines, and polygons. We get a little bit more flexibility and it can be a little bit more interactive. So I have high hopes that in the next 5 or 10 years, we'll actually start seeing some different map projections because computationally it will be so much easier to do things other than Web Mercator.
And now that I've been educated, I can see that practically everything I look at seems to be a Web Mercator. And I realize this wouldn't be an issue for local mapping, but does Tableau give me an option of using other projections?
There aren't options for other projections that are built in, though it is actually possible to use alternate projections in Tableau if you really want to. So this is something that I had been challenged to do a few months ago by another person in the company who was complaining about not being able to make polar maps. So in Web Mercator, another thing is that it chops off the data above and below 85 degrees north and south. So if you want to do something like an Antarctic map, how can you do that in a Web Mercator environment? I can't map the poles. But if you get creative with a geographic information system, you can actually make things like polar maps or use alternate map projections. You just have to weasel things around a little bit. I've actually written a number of blog posts about that we have up on our Tableau community forums, and I'd be happy to share those with anybody who's interested, because it should work both in Tableau and in other mapping systems, so long as you can bring in things like map box tiles or your own custom base map tiles.
Well, thank you for that information. Now, the audience asks, they were very interested in the portion of your talk that differentiated between color schemes for numeric, categorical, and ordered mapping data. Does Tableau have presets or defaults that help us avoid those problems, or is that something that we're always going to have to watch manually when we make our maps?
No, I mean, most mapping software is going to make some pretty good guesses for you to start out. So if I put in a numeric data set, typically I'm going to get a continuous color ramp that is, light shade to dark shade. If I, at least in Tableau, if I put in a data set that has a 0 point in the middle, so I've got positive values and negative values, I believe we default to giving you a diverging color scheme, which may be what you want or it may not be what you want, but it's a pretty intuitive guess based on the fact that you do have values on both sides of this recognizable, typically used inflection point of 0. The same is true with qualitative data. So if you bring in categorical data, text strings, class 1, class 2, class 3, class 4, we're going to give you a set of unique hues that are attached to each one of those. And we actually have a really great color scientist that works at the company that has worked on helping make sure that we are giving you the best guess based on what we can pull out of your data. But a challenge is always that you know your data really well, and we're just making guesses based on whether we see strings, whether we see numbers, whether we see positive and negative values. And so we're making a guess, and hopefully you're going to then refine that guess. And there won't be too many steps for you to take to do that refinement, but you'll probably still want to do a little bit of customization.
Well, thank you for that insight. Now, one of our audience members has asked about using icons instead of colors on maps. So I guess we ought to ask, how do you feel about that? And if you think that's a reasonable approach, how would we do it?
So I'm interpreting that as using icons at point locations instead of colors that we would use for polygon regions, for instance. And I think that's a totally valid way of symbolizing data on your map. It's a question of what is the pattern and what is the data that you're trying to represent. For instance, if you have city locations, the cities are naturally going to come in as points. So just having a colored point may not be as intuitive as having a sized symbol, whether it's a sized circle or a sized logo for Starbucks because you want to show the number of Starbucks in every city or the number of Wi-Fi hotspots. In that case, the symbol is really going to be a lot more intuitive than just a plain circle with a color on it, because people are going to have this intuitive ability to see the symbol, understand the meaning of the symbol, assuming it's well designed, and go from there. So it really depends on what type of data you're working with. Typically with polygon data, you're going to use some sort of hue or color. to do your symbolization, whereas with point locations, oftentimes, a custom symbol is really a nicer way to go.
Oh, well, thank you for that information. Now, you spent a lot of time in your presentation talking about the design of data breaks, I think is the way to put it. And the question comes from the audience. In many GIS systems, they use natural breaks as the default. Is that a good general purpose classification scheme? And better yet, is there some ideal?
Yeah, so natural breaks is often chosen as a default, and I think it's because with the natural break scheme, what you're doing is you're dividing the data so that you have less variation within any given class in the classification scheme and greater variation between the classes in the classification scheme. So in that sense, it's doing a nice job with looking at the distribution of the data values, and it can often be a good place to start if you're really in the data exploration phase of your mapping project. When you get to the communication process, or if you have specific elements that are relevant for the exploration, for instance, you really want to be able to compare to a statewide average, or you have standard class breaks that are used inside your organization, or you really want 10-unit class breaks, then natural breaks really becomes a less relevant option to use because it's not giving you something that's going to be useful for the patterns that you are looking for in your data set. I think that, so long as you're in exploration, I think natural breaks are great for understanding basic patterns. But once you get into looking for details, I think you really want to go with something that's a little more customized to your question.
Makes perfect sense. Thank you. Thank you for that clarification. Now, our audience asks, if they wanted to do a little more deep dive on this or wanted to have some inspiration in their map making, do you have any recommendations on good general purpose references or sites or information that our audience could seek out?
Yeah, I think there are a ton of great things online. For instance, Color Brewer, I think, is a great resource. If you Google that, it's great for color choices, and it walks you through a lot of the classification questions you might ask. But if you really like having a print guide, one of the things that I fall back on all the time is there's this little pocket-sized book that was made by the British Cartographic Society, and they've just put out the second version of it. That it's something like 12 pounds or something, which I don't know what that translates to in dollars, but I used to pick up copies for that and give them to my students because I felt like, it was about 50 pages long, and it was just a really well put together, quick reference for a lot of cartographic problems. So I would recommend that. I can't remember the exact title of the book right now off the top of my head, but if you look for the British Cartographic Society, you'll find that in their bookstore.
Okay, and websites or Tableau resources?
Websites or Tableau resources, we have a great knowledge base. I think our knowledge base and the videos that we have related to map making are really great resources to have. And we've got a great maps team that's always willing to answer questions as well.
Well, Sarah, thank you for some great answers to some very good questions. And for those of you that asked questions today that weren't answered, we'll be sending all the unanswered questions to Sarah and the Tableau team so they can follow up with you after today's webinar. I have just a few quick announcements. If you'd please mark your calendars for October 24th, that's our next DSC webinar, which will be Apache Spark and Agile Model Development, to be sponsored by Databricks. Also remember that today's taping will be available for on-demand viewing later today, and you can find that on the homepage of datasciencecentral.com in the webinar tab located at the top of the page. Well, this brings today's webinar to a close. I'd like to thank our audience for their attendance and thoughtful questions. A special thanks again to Tableau for sponsoring today's event, as well as to our speaker, Sarah Battersby, for her insight into today's topic. This is Bill Vorhies. I'm very pleased to have been your host for today's event. I look forward to seeing you all again on October 24th. Have a great day.